let me introduce an interview with Paul Polman, that is the co-founder and chair of Imagine. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be joined by Paul Polman. Paul, you don't really need an introduction, but you were one of the people that first thought about sustainability, especially when you were in charge at Unilever. You really tried to do everything you can to have a purpose when you're a business. What does COVID-19 mean for this transition? Are we going to accelerate the transition to more sustainability, to regenerate, or is it going to take a back step?
Well, thanks, Francine. And first of all, congratulations to the wonderful people there, Andrea, David, Maria Paulo, for putting on Regeneration 2030, and for Parma to host it as a cultural city. I couldn't think of a more important event. Coming to your question, it is no doubt that COVID has accelerated the conversion to a more environmentally and socially acceptable model of capitalism, if I may call it that way. People have understood that you cannot have healthy people on an unhealthy planet, and the relationships between biodiversity, climate change, human health, racial dimension, economy is now better understood. What we need to watch out, obviously, is there's a lot of a step up that we clearly see in promises that are being made. We now need to ensure that the say-do gap is closed as well. I believe we're moving in the right direction. Where the challenge will be is the speed and scale. And it's not surprising that we're moving in the right direction. 90% of people across the world want an economy that works for all. We see the financial market accelerating because they've seen better returns on ESG, and impact investing, green bonds, etc., has rapidly moved to being a 2 trillion market. In fact, we've seen more inflow since COVID than at any time before. And not surprisingly, we see governments, the responsible governments, starting to move. An announcement from China to be climate zero by 2060, to stay within more or less the 1.5 degree warming. Or the Europeans upping their commitments under the Green Deal have obviously sent clear commitments that we need to have a better, greener, more inclusive economic system. Two challenges with that, which are very important. We do need global cooperation, like the pandemic, climate change, and many of the other issues that undoubtedly will be talked in the next few days, need countries to work together. And secondly, we need to evolve our accounting system. We treasure what we measure. So if we start to account for natural and social capital as much as financial capital, I believe we have all possibilities to create this better and more inclusive system that Regeneration 2030 is aspiring to.
But Paul, we also have, as heads of state, people that are still climate change deniers. So if we can't change their mind, is it really up to private companies to do everything they can? And can private companies actually fill that vacuum?
Well, climate change deniers, by any measure now, if you believe in science, often climate change deniers don't believe in science, is less than 10% of the world population. And we actually see the same group being deniers of COVID. It nearly is linked to conspiracy theories that we don't have a pandemic. So my strategy there, which I would advise, is don't really concentrate too much on those people anymore. The train has left the station. Even in the US, we have now 75% of the US economy taking climate action. We're actually moving fast with things like We Are Still In or the America Pledge. And hopefully we'll see a change as well after the elections. So the best thing we can do is to ensure that these deniers that are still out there, that they don't contaminate the others, but the others are moving quite quickly already.
Do we need to define exactly what we're talking about to make sure that, as you say, we close the gap between what we say and what we're doing? And how important is it that we have, a common definition, taxonomy, so that actually the business community, chief executive, investors know what they're talking about and they're comparing fairly?
Yeah, it's absolutely important, because what is one of the things that continues to come back from the financial market is we don't understand the materiality or the comparability. And there are initiatives now with IFRS, GRI, SASB, the Sustainable Accounting Standard Board, and others that finally have decided not to each go their own route and do a little bit, but to collectively start to work. We're seeing that moving on climate itself with the Task Force of Financial Disclosure, now law, by the way, in New Zealand, a very courageous move. And we're increasingly seeing also that these other measures are starting to evolve. And under the European Green Deal, as you well know, increasingly companies need to report on environmental and social measures. So we see that companies that integrate this in their reporting also make more progress, not surprisingly. They probably run more responsibly, but we also see increasingly that they're actually producing better results. And I personally believe that those will be the resilient companies that come out of this terrible pandemic stronger than ever.
How can we be sure that some of the recovery money, for example, in Europe, goes to these green projects? And do we have a very short window? I always, ask you about the timeline. Is it in the next 12 months where we can really make a difference? Otherwise, we forget and have to deal with the next economic crisis.
Francine, you're totally right. In the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, we absolutely missed the opportunity. We put a lot of money in to rescue the banks, but we did not spend any money, less than 2.5%, to ensure that we get this greener, better future. People felt that banks were too big to fail, but people were too small to matter. We saw climate change going up, we saw inequality going up, and it led to populism and nationalism in the polls and the things like Brexit or the US elections. We've now spent behind COVID already $12 trillion just to save lives and stabilize economies, basically protecting livelihoods. The risk now is obviously that the governments have run out of money and will not spend enough behind the recovery. One of the major challenges we will have is job creation, especially amongst the youth. The ILO, the International Labour Organization, estimates that we've lost about the equivalent of 500 million jobs. And it's difficult to see how we can get these jobs back at the speed that we need. So it's all about job creation. And the greener investments that we need to make moving forward, they also happen to be better job creators. Currently, we measure about 30% of the spend is going to a greener economy, but with the G20, which is meeting in a week's time, and some of the other global efforts, we collectively need to insist that most of that spending is conditional to getting to this greener, more inclusive economy.
Is there a danger that, we're going through the transition, but that it's still too slow? If you look at, some of the documentaries out there, we have 20, 30 years left. If we take 10 years for this transition, it might be too late.
Well, it's too late to be a pessimist, and I think we need to stay optimist. With any study that we do, we can actually get there if we collectively put our shoulders under this. But as you rightfully say, we're not moving at the speed and scale. Just for perspective, the climate reductions, the emission reductions we saw of CO2 as a result of COVID are barely what we need every year between now and 2050 to stay below 1.5 degrees. And the way we did this is certainly not recommendable. So indeed, you are right. We need to ensure that the governments now move faster and that we get the recovery plans to reflect actually this future that we all desire to have.
Paul, what would a green economy look like? One of the things that we try and figure out in the newsroom at Bloomberg a lot is everyone has great intentions, but does it mean that I can no longer go on holiday once COVID is over? Does it mean that I need to stop eating meats? Like, how do you see the economy that we should be working towards?
Well, the major transitions which you start see happening is an energy transition that obviously is towards green energy. 70 to 80% of the countries already have energy with wind and solar and thermal that is cheaper than fossil fuel. Yet the governments in this world still have 500 billion of per subsidies on fossil fuel. The US administration, thanks to the heavy lobbying of the fossil fuel industry, is spending twice as much money in this recovery behind the fossil old industry than they do behind the new industry. And that is obviously one of the things we need to do. The second thing, which is very important and getting more attention now on the global agenda, is investing in nature. Nature-based solutions are about 30% of the solutions to climate change. And many people are now understanding the values of nature. We're currently on a trajectory to potentially destroy the equivalent of $44 trillion in net nature services that business needs but currently doesn't pay for. Increasingly, companies understand that. Big companies like Microsoft, Walmart, Unilever are all making billion-dollar commitments to restore nature. So the future is better, more resilient jobs and better paying jobs in an environment where we can breathe the air, where we can live in harmony with nature, and where we don't destroy resources that we also want future generations to use. It's also a future that is more inclusive. Currently, we've discovered with COVID, we have 1.6 billion vulnerable workers, 100 million people pushed back into poverty. In the US, 86% of the job destruction is with people that earn less than $40,000 a year who haven't seen their income move in the last 40 years. So inclusive economy, a just transition is as much part of it as the sustainable part we just talked about.
But how hard is it given COVID? I know, you say it's an opportunity because actually you're rebuilding the economy anyway. But how hard is it if you're in charge of an economy, if you're a big chief executive, to deal with a crisis and building forward better?
Well, actually, for the business community, it probably is a little easier because they see the costs that they incur increasingly every day by not acting. And we see really a movement happening in the financial market and in the private sector to start to move. But ultimately, we need to do that together with governments. If we don't have the right frameworks, the right global agreements, the right things that count in terms of measurements, governance, and some of the other things, then it is more difficult. This is one of the biggest transitions of an economy we've ever made, to decarbonize our global economy, to move to a regenerative economy, to make it more inclusive, move the financial markets to the longer term. And the biggest challenge in all of this is global governance that, to put it politely, is probably at an all-time low. So if a big part of this, if I may be direct, Francine, in my normal Dutch style, is going to be the outcome of the US elections. And I could really encourage everybody that is able to vote to actually vote there, because there's going to be a big difference how quickly the world can move collectively in a direction versus what currently seems to be a trajectory in the wrong direction and with a great disdain for global cooperation.